Welcome back. My name is Madeline Fitzgerald again, and I am the manager of adult programs here at the Carter. Thank you all for joining us for our second talk of the day as part of our Gentling Symposium, featuring the 3 Gentling Fellows and the curators who have researched the brothers over the last few years in preparation for the exhibition Imagined Realism, Scott and Stuart Gentling. On behalf of the museum, I would especially like to welcome and thank our members who are in the audience this afternoon. It is because of your generosity that our collection and our special exhibitions are free and open to everyone. If you are not currently a member, I encourage you to join after the talk by visiting the membership table or the website cartermuseum.org. We especially want to thank Edward P. Bass for being the founding champion and supporter of the Gentling Study Center at the Carter, as well as his support of the Imagined Realism exhibition. We want to also thank all of you for your understanding of our current COVID-19 policies, which include the recommendation of wearing masks while in the auditorium during the lectures today. Additionally, I would like to thank the TCC Sign Language Program for their partnership with the Carter. These intern students and faculty will be an ongoing presence at talks and other public programs, and I'm thrilled that you all are here today to support our program. As a reminder, if you haven't already, to please take this time to silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices you may have. I would like to invite all of you again, and if you were here at the 10:30 talk, you've already heard me tell you this, but you're a captive audience, so I'm going to tell you again, to please visit the Carter next month for our second Thursdays at the Carter. Every second Thursday at the museum, you can connect with art through cocktails, conversations, and creativity. Each month, you'll find something different, from performances, artist talks, and unique tours, to art making, music, and films. I hope you will join us for December 9th's second Thursday, which is themed local and legendary and will be focused on the Gentling exhibition. The evening will include a performance by the Debbie Brooks Chamber Ensemble, who will be playing music inspired by Scott and Stuart's portraits of composers. You can go on a tour of the exhibition focused on the Aztec works with SMU professor and pre-Columbian art expert Adam Herring. Or you can explore the French frocks with Annette Becker, the director of the Texas Fashion Collection at UNT. You'll also be able to try your hand at watercolor painting, grab a cocktail with members getting their first drink for free, all in one night. It'll be a great evening, and we hope you'll join us on Thursday, December 9th. You can visit cartermuseum.org to register for this free event. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers this afternoon. I keep doing that. It's just a habit. We normally have lectures on the evenings. First, we'll hear from Gentling Fellow, Dr. Erika Doss, who will expand on the topic about where the brothers fit into American art history. Erika Doss, who received her PhD from the University of Minnesota, is a professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Her wide-ranging interests in modern and contemporary American art are reflected in the breadth of her publications, including Benton, Pollock, and the Politics of Modernism, From Regionalism to Abstract Expressionism, which was published in 1991 and received the Charles C. Eldridge Prize, as well as Spirit Poles and Flying Pigs, Public Art and Cultural Democracy in American Communities from 1995, as well as Elvis Culture, Fans, Faith, and Image, published in 1999, Looking at Life magazine, in which she was the editor of in 2001, The Emotional Life of Contemporary Public Memorials, Towards a Theory of Temporary Memorials, published in 2008, Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America from 2010, and Monumental Troubles, Rethinking What Monuments Mean Today, in which she was the editor of in 2018. Her revised textbook, American Art of the 20th and 21st Centuries, was published in 2017. Doss is also co-editor of the Culture America series at the University Press of Kansas and is on the editorial boards of Memory Studies, Public Art Dialogue, Material Religion, the Journal of Objects, Art, and Belief, and the Journal of Transnational American Studies. The recipient of several Fulbright Awards, Doss has held fellowships at the Stanford Humanities Center, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Research Center, Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies, and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Following Doss this afternoon, Spencer Wigmore will share a case study of the Brothers of Birds and Texas project that showcases their creative process. Spencer is the Carter's Associate Curator of Paintings, Sculpture, and Works on Paper, who specializes in 19th century American landscape painting. Prior to working at the Carter, Spencer earned his master's in art history from the University of Delaware, as well as his PhD with a dissertation focused on American landscape artist Albert Bierstadt. After Spencer speaks, we will transition into a short Q&A with all of you. I will have a microphone, which will allow for your questions to be heard on the recording of this afternoon's lecture, which we will be uploading to the Carter's YouTube account in the next few weeks. Immediately following the talk, we will break for an hour. During this time, Gentling curator Jonathan Fremling will be giving a guided tour of the Imagined Realism exhibition for anyone who is interested in stretching their legs a little bit. We will meet at the entrance of the exhibition right around 2 p.m. when this talk is done. The tour will end before our final talk of the day, which will begin at 3 o'clock. And now, please join me in welcoming Erika Doss and Spencer Wigmore.
Thank you, Madeline, and thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. I know it's sunny and nice outside, but we like to spend our time in the dark, right? So I first became acquainted with the Gentling twins just a few years ago. In 2019, I was appointed the first Gentling Fellow here at the Amon Carter, and asked to participate in the catalog project that accompanies the museum's retrospective exhibition upstairs, titled Imagined Realism. And I'm looking forward to the tour at 2 o'clock with John, because John has really been involved in this project from the get-go. It was my good fortune to be involved in this massive Gentling-centered enterprise. And I want to thank, before I start talking this afternoon, not this evening, I want to thank the staff here at the Amon Carter who made my visits to Fort Worth both possible and productive, starting with John. John Fremling is the Gentling curator, librarian, archivist, Janelle Montgomery, the Gentling curatorial assistant, and Will Gillum, who unfortunately isn't here this afternoon, Director of Publications. And it's really been a pleasure to work with all of you on this project. Much of this project was prompted by the unique opportunity to explore and examine the Gentlings and their art through their archives. An extensive repository, and here we see just a tiny fragment that I've jammed onto this particular image, of Scott and Stewart's personal papers, photographs, studies, sketches, letters, unpublished manuscripts, tax returns, which I found fascinating, and more that has been acquired by the Amon Carter and supplemented by the establishment of the Gentling Study Center just a couple of years ago. Extensive artist-centered archives like this one are very rare and become real treasure troves for art historians and scholars and others who are simply interested in getting at the personal and the professional details of their subjects' lives and careers. On the bottom right, for example, we see a letter from scientist Jane Goodall thanking Scott for the portrait he did of her in 1990. "I was really terrified," she wrote to him, "when I was led off to see it," the portrait, and because I'd never before seen a portrait of me that I thought looked like me for better or worse. But what you have done is just exactly me, for better or for worse. When I say more, I really mean more. The Gentling archives are an exhilarating, if somewhat exhausting, body of materials that testify to the multiple sources, subjects, and practices of these twin artists. Their artistic and personal interests were many, as we heard from Scott Barker this morning, from birds and historical costumes to classical composers, vernacular architecture, especially Texan, Mesoamerican pottery, the Aztec Empire before Spanish conquest, and the luminous canvases of the 17th century Dutch painter Vermeer. And I think that this panoply of themes and subjects is neatly encapsulated in this great painting by Stewart, which is titled Symposium and was painted in 1990. Scott and I are essentially self-motivated curiosity seekers, Stewart observed in 2002. Their paintings, he added, were sort of like a diary of our interest. Now, those interests included portraiture, which became a Gentling financial mainstay. Scott habitually sketched figures from life and from photographs. Early subjects ranged from friends like Shirley, painted in 1964. Note the inscription on the bottom left, which I've enlarged, and talks about To Shirley with Love at Christmas Time from Scott, 1964. He also painted portraits of other artists, such as regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton, who was one of Scott's American art role models. Scott had the opportunity to sketch Benton when he was in Fort Worth visiting businessman John Paxton in 1964, and he gave the sketch then to Paxton's son, Bill, who was a friend. He wrote at the bottom, and you can see there on the bottom right, especially for Bill, who was there that day. And then he provides this extensive sort of information about what he actually did. Thomas Hart Benton from Life, December 18, 1964, by Scott Gentling. Color notes, dark blue jacket, mustard-colored shirt, chocolate-colored tie. And yet, this is not all colored in, right? So it seems to suggest that he was perhaps creating a preparatory drawing for a later painting. Scott also made a number of self-portraits, including that really good-looking one on the far left. And these were done when he was studying at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. And he studied there for approximately 4 years on and off, 1962 to 1966. His brother came in 1965 and studied for just less than a year. More portraits over the decades featured pets. I don't know whose pet this is, but it's some sort of shaggy white cat, and composers. In the 1990s, Scott produced a series of some 20 composers' portraits, and several of them are included upstairs, which he intended as, quote, a veritable shrine to the profound effect that their music, that these musicians and their music had on him. He also painted many commissioned portraits, as Scott mentioned this morning, of politicians and businessmen. After he painted George Bush's portrait in 2001, he was able to charge as much as $45,000 per figure for a 3/4 length portrait, which would be based on a single photograph. And this, as I mentioned, is their financial mainstay, particularly during the last several decades of their lives. Scott also sketched and painted many, many artists, which implies that he also knows a lot of artists, not just in the Fort Worth area, but literally around the country, from Ed Ruscha, who we see on the left and is an LA-based artist, although from this area, and Andrew Wyatt, whom we see on the right. Also, Clara Mcdonald Williamson, a self-taught Texas artist, folk artist. Anybody know her work? Okay. Sort of akin to Grandma Moses. And he painted the portrait that we see here on the left for the Amon Carter retrospective that was held here at the museum. Unfortunately, this portrait of Aunt Clara, as she was called, seems to be missing from the Gentling pantheon. So if any of you know the whereabouts of this thing, please let us know. Thank you. And Over a period, as Scott mentioned, of some 23 years, Scott painted multiple portraits of East Texas farmers, Clementine and Ed McGarry, who lived near Caseta in a 2-room clapboard cabin. The McGarrys grew crops and raised animals on a former Cass County cotton plantation that had been established by slaveholder John Hurd in the 1850s. A college friend at Tulane shared photographs of his home area, which included the shack that they lived in. And after meeting the McGarrys, Scott asked to paint them and their home, which he did repeatedly over the next 2 decades. The long, hot days of posing them were made bearable, he later related, by Eddie's stories about local history and customs, including ways of dealing with creatures that threaten their crops. These and similar portraits were featured at Scott's first solo show at Valley House in Dallas in 1966, and also his second show there in 1968, both of which completely sold out. And Scott wrote, several scarecrows dressed and turbaned like voodoo priestesses celebrating some secret ritual are the subject matter of Harvest. This is a scene taken at the McGarry homestead, painted much later, and it becomes one of the landscape paintings that the Gentlings included in their 1986 portfolio of birds and Texas. And this is upstairs. The Gentling archives really showcase the brothers' expertise in multiple media, including printmaking. Here's an etching that Scott produced in 1964. In watercolor, this picture is fairly typical of the dry brush watercolor technique that they both employed. And mural painting. Here we see notes for the foliage motif that covers the walls of Bass Hall in downtown Fort Worth, and Stewart painting them on the far right. Each artist was an independent artist, but they also collaborated. And Stewart, it seemed, sketched scenes, and Scott often finessed their details in paint. Both artists, importantly, aimed to demystify the techniques that they used as artists. The archives feature this important set of drawings that they produced, detailing the 6 steps that they used in their bird drawings, including outlining, tracing, and transfer from one medium to another. And I think that it was likely that they had hoped to publish this at some point in order to share, this idea that art making was not mystery, but it was something that could be absolutely learned. I mean, they had deep interest, I think, in sharing the supposed trade secrets of picture making. And I think that's very democratic, and it's also very inviting. I think they recognize, too, that their concentrated, labor-intensive process of picture making was a learned skill based on practice and repetition. It was not necessarily an innate talent born to a gifted few. And then the archives give us these sort of weird insights into who they were as people and their sense of humor. Here, for example, are various music and art-themed recipes that the Gentlings imagined. And I have no idea if these were actually cooked. We've got poulet Audubon on the left. I have, it's basically a chicken recipe. And then artichoke soup Mozart on the right. I don't even want to know what's in that. Okay, so one fascinating aspect of the Gentlings and their archives is their use of historical costumes, which we've discussed a little bit so far today. This is the source material for a good deal of their drawings and their paintings, and we've got quite a nice selection of them upstairs. Scott started collecting historic costumes in the mid-1960s, and he purchased them from dealers in England and also in France. And he was doing so in order to imitate the practice of his artistic role model, Andrew Wyatt. Scott's tax return in 1966 claimed expenses of $785 for, quote, dated costumes used as models for painting. So he's absolutely using them in work early in the mid-1960s. Andrew Wyatt, like his father, the illustrator and painter N.C. Wyatt, and also like American artists Norman Rockwell and Howard Pyle, all kept large collections of vintage clothing, vintage costumes, in order to dress their models and evoke the look and feel of past historical eras. In 2005, Scott painted Wyatt wearing this tricorn hat, also on display upstairs, both photograph and hat. And he's here working from photographs that Stewart took of Wyatt when he visited him at his summer home in Cushing, Maine in 2004. So by the end of the 1960s, the Gentlings had amassed their own very large collection of historical costumes, mostly menswear, coats, jackets, breeches, embroidered waistcoats, military uniforms, walking sticks, gloves, shoes, cockades, focusing primarily on French and English costumes from the late 18th century. Their collection, which almost reached 200 pieces, included a pair of kid gloves owned by Charles I. The archives tell us where they got these things, how much they paid. So here's an interesting invoice on the left from a firm in England, and who wore them. So here we see the source for the dark velvet coat that Ed Ruscha posed in around 1970. And here is the source for that tricorn hat worn by Wyatt. And today, all of these costumes, this collection, are available to see. They're housed, at least, at the Texas Fashion Collection at the University of North Dallas. They are, University of North Texas. They are not, apparently, in very good shape because one of the rules of historical costumes is you don't wear them. And both of them like to put them on and dress others as well. Importantly, Scott's interest in these costumes was not nostalgic. I have no desire to return to history. I've studied it too closely for that, he observed in 1978. Rather, these costumes were experiential time travel tools, giving him and Stewart temporary access to a very highly selective past. And it is very interesting that it's late 18th century, early 19th century that they're most interested in, England and France, not really elsewhere. I got these costumes because not only were they beautiful, Scott remarked, but I wanted to find out what they really looked like back then, how it felt to wear them, how it felt to wear one of these costumes, or how it felt to walk around, the whole ambiance of it, the tone of an age. So he's really into this idea of putting something on in order to both understand how it was made, but also how it made people feel. This 1989 watercolor was dedicated to French Revolution martyr Jean-Paul Marat, but by extension, based on Scott's use of visual props, was also an homage to French artist Jacques-Louis David. It's interesting how Scott substituted a corduroy coat draped over a chair and a hat peeking out of that chair, decorated with a tricolor cockade to evoke this narrative of revolution and death. John Fremling remarks that the Gentlings were very performative in their attention to historical costumes, and they both liked to dress up their friends in these particular clothes. Here we see Scott on the left dressed like a dandy in a late 18th century outfit, and on the right dressed in a 19th century outfit imitating, perhaps, American artist Thomas Cole, the subject of Asher B. Durand's painting on the right, Kindred Spirits. In the painting, Cole is the figure depicted on the far right of the two figures on the ledge. He's the one holding the portfolio. Costumes, in other words, were material and visual devices that the Gentlings used to position themselves as American artists of today, or the 1970s, the 1980s, on similar or equal standing with artists from the past, from David to Thomas Cole to Asher B. Durand. They have a real nuanced understanding then of their historical position as American artists. However, in the decade that they worked, from the 1960s through the early 20th century, their style of American art was at odds with dominant movements. And we can think here of pop art, we can think of minimalism. As a result, the Gentlings were largely ignored in the history of American art. But importantly, that history is fluid, not fixed. Today's symposium, today's exhibition, and the establishment of the Gentling Studies Center and access for all of us to the Gentling archives speaks to a reclamation of Scott and Stewart's art in two ways. First, the Gentlings are today recognized for the contributions that they made to enduring strains of realism and representation and what I want to argue for in terms of regionalism in American art. And second, their art represents a commitment to a Texas kind of regionalism, not a kind of, I'm going to go back here, not a kind of rah-rah nativism bent on secession and sexism, but a Lone Star State sensibility focused on regional geography, wildlife, and the fleeting evidence of human intervention in the landscape. And we see this repeatedly in their particular landscapes. In art school in Philadelphia, Scott studied with John McCoy. We've seen some of his examples today, the brother-in-law of Andrew Wyatt. McCoy taught Scott to develop a very close, even meditative style of focused observation, and to refine his vision with techniques, including a mixed media process which involved successive layers of watercolor, oil, and acrylic and pastel that produced subtle lighting effects and atmospheric detail. Lessons in craft were accompanied by studies in composition, and learning that even realist styles of art, realist ideas, are inherently subjective, the product of transforming and refining ideas from one medium to another. What the artist actually sees, Philip Perlstein, a realist artist, wrote in a very widely circulated 1962 essay, is a kaleidoscope of forms that are only a point of departure for the final work of art. Scott absorbed his insights, as I think that these particular representations of the cistern reveal. A cistern is a water storage tank, emphasizing both the personal and the professional or more fundamentally constructed aspects of his pictures. He stated in 1968, "I am no more a realist than Jackson Pollock or Franz Klein or Frank Stella." All right, he's making a concerted comparison between himself, his art, and the art of abstract artist. Like their work, my paintings are no more than objects, flat surfaces covered with paint. The value of art, he said, was in how it reflects the ageless search for awareness, which is the common denominator of the human condition. Scott's work is often compared with that of Andrew Wyatt, and I think there are strong similarities, as we see here in this comparison of Scott's airing out on the left and Wyatt's sea boots on the right. Both artists worked primarily in dry brush watercolor and tempera and were disciplined, meticulous craftsmen. Both repeatedly painted rural landscapes, the environments of their respective regions, Texas and Maine. Farms, barns, sheds, fields, thickets of trees. Both were drawn to seemingly mundane scenes and studies of things, boots, buckets, barrels, chairs, and more, things left or abandoned in certain places. And both collected vintage costumes and painted them draped over chairs, discarded on floors, or hanging by themselves in quiet, dusty rooms. But Scott cringed at the suggestion that he was a mere copycat, a Wyatt wannabe, which is how he was described. In a 1978 interview with Dallas reporter Patsy Swank, he observed, "Some people compare me with Andrew Wyatt. They know neither of our works very well. For one thing, my moods are entirely different. I do not have his sense of mortality in my work. I paint something akin to poetic dramas." Okay, so I'm waiting for the poetic drama from this particular work. In an earlier interview, he said, "I wish I could compose like Andrew Wyatt, but my work is much happier than his. Wyatt's paintings have a latent violence completely lacking in mine. I strive for compassion and humor." And I think that in a sense, this Gentling humor comes through, and it comes through in some paintings more than others. For example, this one, which has sort of this waggish benevolence going on, but a kind of sympathy, and particularly a regionalist sympathy, which I do agree with him, is typically lacking in Andrew Wyatt's paintings and drawings. This sense of compassion, particularly extended to his and Scott's focus on the landscapes and scenery of Texas and parts of Louisiana. As noted, he and Stewart started at Tulane University in 1961, and then while Scott went on to study in Philadelphia a year or so later, his regional geographic attachment was set. Concentrating on landscapes featuring delta marshes, gravel roads, cypress breaks used in duck hunting, limestone creek beds, and drought-ravaged ranches, Scott established himself as a contemporary American regionalist. "I want to paint the life of the South," he told a reporter in 1966. "There's such a struggle there between the land and man. I want to paint those weather-beaten, abandoned houses before they rot." I think that struggle is exemplified not only in this painting, but in earlier watercolors, this 1963 watercolor, for example, of the river road above New Orleans, which was a corridor along the Mississippi River, which he described on the reverse as, quote, "one of the very first landscapes I ever did." The archives are full of these sorts of references, these photographs, to some works that are missing, but also to his and Stewart's explanation of how and why they did what they did. Likewise, in this dry brush watercolor painted a year later, which also gives us a sense of how he's changing very rapidly in style, he depicted a few rundown and seemingly abandoned tin-roofed shacks on the edge of a dry and dusty field. This scene, which is included in the exhibition upstairs, and is drolly titled Windsor Castle, captured the ruins of the Windsor Mansion, the towering rows of some 23 Corinthian columns, nicknamed the Stonehenge of the South. Has anybody been to this in this? Okay, I'd love to go see this. That are all that remain of the largest antebellum Greek revival villa built in Mississippi, destroyed by fire in 1890. Augmenting in this quickly done watercolor, we get themes of loss and decline. Look at how almost half of the drawing on the far right, the watercolor, focuses on this dilapidated barn. His 1966 Hackberry Tree similarly depicts an abandoned cattle loading pen on an East Texas ranch, and these resilient shrubs and trees that persevere. It was exhibited first at his Valley House Gallery show in 1966, and then it was reproduced in 1974 in an edition of 1,000, priced at $40 each for Regency House Art, which was a New York firm that represented popular wildlife artists with limited edition giclée prints, basically high-quality digital reproductions of original works of art made in large format inkjet printers. And they sold literally thousands of their prints this way, including the one that's retitled Hackberries from Hackberry Trees, the painting. Dismissed as trash trees, hackberries tolerate challenging conditions, from droughts to floods. They're among the oldest known sources of foraged food on Earth. Scott cast them as stalwart survivors in the Texas regionalism that he crafted in these early landscape paintings, a narrative of commonplace settings, economic struggle, the lingering presence of a ruined past, and distinctive natural beauty. Avoiding a romanticized bluebonnet style of Texas country regionalism or a sentimental Sunday painter kind of Texas populism, Scott crafted a Lone Star State regionalism focused on loss and endurance. His concept of a regionally themed body of work stemmed from his mentors and artistic role models, Andrew Wyatt, John McCoy, and Thomas Hart Benton. And critics commended Scott's regional vision in their reviews, and this is in the 1960s. Gentling has particularly excelled at portraying Texas and Southern landscapes, James Meeker wrote in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, observing that Scott's, quote, philosophy to continue to paint in areas he knows well, with travel to refresh his points of view, is as sound as his work is exciting, and the continuing maturity of his work can only result in further conceptual richness. Likewise, Dallas Morning News writer John Neville remarked on Scott's many field trips to East Texas where, quote, he finds subjects to work with, people, places, things of interest, and noted that his primary concern was with an interpretation in depth of the South. He wants not simply to show how it is and how people look and live, but to also interpret the mood, the soul, if you wish, of the region. Neville added that Scott spends countless hours traveling through the countryside, visiting general stores, talking to the natives, taking photographs from which he sometimes works, and in general, wrapping that atmosphere around himself. And this is a publicity photo that was actually taken in conjunction with that first solo show at Valley House. So there are a variety of photos showing Scott at work, holding his portfolio, looking like the serious artist he was at age 23. Now, Scott recognized that his character studies were critical to his regional reputation, but he was also very protective of them. In 1966, the Dallas Museum of Art offered $5,000 for Portrait of Eddie, but Scott turned them down. He told Stewart, "Of course I refused. That picture is going to a very special person who really deserves it, and to a place where it will always receive the best of care and attention. And it makes me feel good to know that it is the best present I can give to anyone." I'm presuming that he meant to actually give it to Eddie, although it wound up in a private collection. Dallas may have wanted Scott's picture of a regionally focused visual, as a regionally focused visual supplement to the pensive portrait that Andrew Wyatt had painted of his African-American neighbor Tom Clark, and the museum purchased in 1962, after a large Andrew Wyatt show at the museum in 1960. In the 1960s, Dallas and Fort Worth museums, critics, and collectors were eager to position Scott Gentling as the Texas version of Andrew Wyatt, only better. In 1973, in an Art News essay on contemporary Texas artist, Henry Hopkins, then director of the Fort Worth Art Center, stated that Scott was among a select set of photorealist artists whose disciplined style of regionalism could already outstrip the master, Andrew Wyatt. Writing at a moment in the early 1970s when an environmental consciousness first, I think, seriously gripped the popular American imaginations, Hopkins used this Art News essay to also bemoan the rapid pace at which urbanization and industrialization were, quote, raping our rural land. Correspondingly, he observed that Scott's regionalist subject matter was drawn from the picturesque decay of the failing rural empire of Texas. Hopkins grasped that Scott's Texas-centric regionalism was contextualized by notions of change over time, that is, artistic attention to decline, ruin, abandonment, and ultimately survival was rooted in a cyclical sense of history. Later works, such as Sanctuary, continued to engage these themes. This painting depicts the crumbling limestone walls of the narthex door of Mission Espiritu Santo, a Spanish mission that was created in 1749 near Goliad, Texas, and restored in the 1930s by the New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps. The mission's narthex entrance, which is what the Gentlings painted, was reserved for indigenous congregants, generally segregated from other churchgoers and prevented from entering the main doors in the front of the mission. In his essay on Sanctuary, which was featured as the very first plate in their portfolio of birds in Texas, Scott wrote, "The missions of Texas represent the oldest tangible remains of European culture on Texas soil, erected when Texas was an ill-defined territory of Mexico, when Mexico was the center of Spanish power in the New World." And he added, "There is a feeling of peace and security about these ancient structures that belies their troubled past." Echoing his and Stewart's fascination with the decline and fall of multiple cultures and civilizations, from the Aztecs, which we'll hear about soon, to Napoleon, his words, I think, are an apt summary of the Lone Star State regionalism that he and his brother produced. Thank you.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming out today. It's a really fun culmination of years and years of research that I was really excited to get to be a part of and contribute to in a small way. I think I have a somewhat different relationship to this material than a lot of the speakers today who were fortunate to take this really panoramic look at what the Gentlings were doing as artists, and my involvement was more focused and really confined to a single project, perhaps their best-known work on the 1986 publication of Birds in Texas, of which we now are home to 40 of the original watercolors for that work. And so with that focus in mind, I thought I would lean into that and just talk about a couple pictures in a little bit more depth in order to explore how the brothers really described and visualized their goals and objectives as artists. I think this is a kind of a complex dimension of their work that sometimes goes under-acknowledged. I think because it's so easy and so fun and enjoyable upstairs to admire the verisimilitude of their works, just this kind of disorienting, bewildering naturalism, their ability to paint with brushwork that's just so fine that it's almost at times like there's no paint at all, like you're looking at a precisely focused photograph or just through a window onto the world. There are certain pictures upstairs that really do that for me. But what really drew me and draws me to their bird project is how often they temper this impulse, and how often it is that they make it difficult to see through the image, to look past the image, and instead really demand that you confront the pictures, as things that are constructed and put together. And this is one of my favorite watercolors from the group. And I'm always struck by how conspicuously posed and unnatural it is, in just this great way. The lower wing of the upper bird is fanned out in this really deliberate way. That left foot is tugged back. The bird's heads are smushed flat against the picture plane, and we're looking at two sides of one bird here. This is not a natural position for a woodcock in flight. The author of these poses is not the creature. It's the Gentlings themselves who would have pulled and prodded at the lifeless features of this bird, which was actually gifted to them by a friend after a hunt. And they found an arrangement that they felt best displayed the physical beauty of this creature. And on top of it, this picture's really flat. Like there's this totally even gray backdrop. That really delicate tracery of winter or autumn sunlight on the water creates a sense of two-dimensionality that it makes it quite easy to read this image as a flat thing, almost as specimens laid out on a table, rather than a landscape that you're looking into. I think is really savvy and deliberate on their part, and is really at the core of what I want to talk about for the next few minutes, which is how the brothers use these visual signs of artifice, the conspicuously constructed quality of these pictures, strategically. It was what they really used, I think, to engage with history. It was something that they really used to do history, and ultimately, I think in this project, kind of rewriting a certain history in their own image. And so in Of Birds of Texas, what they really did was probe the conventions of natural history illustration and develop an argument, really, that the significance of this genre was misunderstood. The watercolor I just showed you was one of the many preparatory works for Of Birds of Texas, this enormous 1986 portfolio of essays and prints. There's 50 halftone prints in the portfolio, all reproductions of original watercolors. 10 are rural Texas landscapes, like what Erika was just talking about. The next 40 are birds that inhabit the state. And each of these prints is paired with a short descriptive essay written by Scott or Stewart. And all of these are packaged unbound in a handmade cloth-clad box, as well as several additional essays, into this massive physical object. It's 46 pounds, and Stewart liked to quip, you've heard of coffee table books? Well, this is a coffee table. It's really a dramatic viewing experience that's quite unique. And that's because when you're leafing through this portfolio, the brothers' words are always there. You'll be an image on the left and an essay on the right. These are actually out of order for the press photograph. And what's happening is the brothers are continually guiding interpretation of the images. And they can do so in a way that's really, really specific and direct. They're not ones to leave a lot of room for interpretation with some of these pictures. And what they're trying to do is assert this really compelling lineage to John James Audubon. We talked about him several times today, the famed artist-naturalist who created Birds of America, an early 19th century folio of more than 400 hand-colored engravings of birds. Scott spoke about how the brothers really saw it was an origin point for them as artists encountering Audubon for the first time. And they declare at the outside that really the goal of this project is to position themselves in a lineage that runs back to him. As much as this is a portfolio of birds of Texas, this is a portfolio of birds that shape their engagement to the 19th century. This is as much about the relationship to history as it is to their regional surroundings. And they do, one of the ways that they assert this lineage isn't just through the essays, and this is, again, what I think is so interesting, is it's through their style specifically here. These birds in particularly are also striking in the way that the woodcock is. They're kind of spatially disjointed from their surroundings. Their white bodies are in this impossibly narrow sliver of space between the picture plane and the foreground, as if the birds had been laid atop the backdrop rather than situated within it. And this upper bird here is kind of levitating across the log. It's too light to crumple the leaf pinned under the front foot. And the lower creature is similarly ungrounded. Its feet are really kind of failing to press into the soft shore despite the presence of footprints. And that bird is opening its wings partially, but seemingly specifically to create this elegant mirror symmetry of curves. And these aren't flaws by any means. What I'm saying is these are deliberate, calculated decisions that they made when putting this together. And they're these reminders, sometimes I think kind of playful and funny ones, that the scene is an artfully composed fiction. It's not just an illustration of a bird in National Geographic. And they're inviting viewers here to think about how Audubon's images as well are put together as an image, where they explain specifically that they liked this bird because it gave them an opportunity to show off an aspect of their style that they felt that they had inherited from an artist that they really admired. So here's Audubon's variant, and you can see how close the translation is, including the ways they really use that wonderful lattice of foliage in the background to create this screen, the way they structure the bird in space. All of that is their unique twist here, that they're pulling this source material from him. And in doing this, and in sort of guiding the viewer towards recognizing these motifs, they make a very assertive, or I could maybe even say aggressive at times, claim that no one else really fully understood the artfulness of Audubon, at least within the parameters of wildlife painting, where Stewart declared in that portfolio that often these artists seem to temper praise of his abilities as a composer of pictures by pointing out that the birds seem kind of unnaturally stiff or distorted. And then they counter this by declaring, quite forcefully at times, that these pictures, that's really not what Audubon was about. That he was about creating beautiful paintings, that it was about arrangements of line and form and color, and that the elegance of Audubon is what people were supposed to be taking and sourcing from that. There's a certain, I think, traditionalism in this impulse and this reading of Audubon, of asserting a sharp distinction between art and science, or art and natural history, defending a notion of genius and kind of arguing that there are right and wrong ways to understand their mentor. But that kind of historical framing is really crucial to what this project is about. So here, again, it's that, just like with the woodcock, all of this is often starting in the pictures with these conspicuous signs of artifice, where artifice is redirecting the viewing experience and getting people to start thinking of these images as containing a very specific dialogue with historical source material. And you see this again and again. I've shown you 2 images from the 40, and I'm almost out of time. But this is coming up throughout the whole series. I think there's at least 20 that have really direct references, and others are hidden throughout this portfolio, where here they simply reverse Audubon, kind of hiding this really delightful reference here, or taking the subject and the pose of these birds, one of Audubon's more playful pictures, House Wren, and giving it a Texas spin in, I think, one of the more technically marvelous works that's in our collection by those artists. And they don't just mimic the past to kind of assert their indebtedness to Audubon as a sort of gesture of gratitude. They use this kind of mimicry in order to make a very specific claim, as I mentioned, about how Audubon should be viewed and understood. And this is, I think, really unique. And this is also, I think, a really weird bird to look at, where you have this very odd and compelling pose, where the bird's head is essentially on backwards. The arms don't quite seem to be coming out to the right side of the body, and the legs are sort of clutching at air, and there's nothing there. And it's a little, mockingbirds do all sorts of crazy things when they're outside, but not crazy quite in this sort of way. And but then again, it's this cue to look deeper, to start hunting. And you see that this is one of Audubon's best-known images, Mockingbird. And you can probably already see a couple of the resonances and affinities that are present here. This is an interesting text in that Scott refers to Audubon, but doesn't explicitly call out how close this relationship is. And here you can really see how they started through a really close and attentive study to what Audubon is doing here. And then on top of that, after kind of creating this visual connection, that's this cue to look for, they emphasize that Audubon, this picture in particular, that Audubon, they praise how he was willing to treat birds as symbols, to use them expressively and not just as representative examples of a particular species. And they pointed out that Audubon, quote, thought that the mockingbird might make a good symbol for our national bird because of the fearlessness, whatever that is, fearlessness, yes, with which it defends its territory and its young against all threats. And Scott explains that in their image, they had done something similar. Certain overtones of territoriality permeate the scene, he writes. A fence encloses a backyard space. Beyond, other houses have their spaces and boundaries plotted, separated, and fixed. And above all this, a vast and starry sky here. So they're taking this symbolic connectedness here and suggesting and proclaiming that that's the dimension that is most important about Audubon. His kind of symbolic and expressive treatment of animals, and that a picture like this should be read as a metaphor for national identity, and as well the more perhaps tendentious claim that Audubon himself intended that his pictures be read in that specific way. You know, for them, they weren't just 20th century versions of Audubon. Audubon was a 19th century Gentling in a lot of ways, and how they choose to attempt to frame their mentor. And we've seen some examples of these. The Gentling papers, I think, have a really wonderful opportunity to show just how closely that they worked with this material here. Here, taking just a mass market reproduction of an Audubon print, adjusting it with an annotation here, already going into correcting it and say that the crest should actually be about a half-inch longer. But what's so fascinating here is that their collaborative relationship as artists was taking place over and on top of and in dialogue with their historical sources in this intensely direct and intimate way. With Stuart typically making a lot of the preparatory sketches and doing the tracing, Scott typically doing a lot of the painting, that relationship, of course, not being ironclad, but that being kind of a good rule of thumb for thinking through these pictures. But this was really a shared statement about the nature of a particular historical tradition that emerged out of a real close study, absorption in, and attentiveness to a certain subject. And to close, I wanted to talk about this picture here, and I was actually excited to see how often these overpaints are coming up today. Scott mentioned this morning that the brothers' careers started by copying Audubon books, by borrowing a book of Birds of America and copying and painting over, that close study was really core to them. Well, it carries all the way through their career as artists. These are now at River Legacy. If you go there, you'll see all these Audubon posters hanging on the wall. Well, they're not posters, they're watercolors, or they're posters that have watercolor coloration all the way through. These would have started as black and white, and then Scott or Stuart at some point, we're not sure exactly when, it was probably Scott, it was probably quite late in life, perhaps even after Stuart's death, went in meticulously hand color corrected all of these posters. It's a really kind of remarkable project, and I think one that for me is like the quintessential distillation of what their visions were as artists, where It's easy to think of these as a technical art exercise, a tool for studying and practicing certain forms and colors and lines favored by their historic predecessors, but they're also really exemplifying in a very material sense the core aesthetic commitments of what they were doing. For on one level, it's asserting a certain traditionalism. We talk about the halftone reproductions that they made, and the brothers were admittedly somewhat ambivalent whether these halftone prints truly qualified as fine art. In public, they would praise these images, declaring that the corresponding watercolors had been intermediate steps on the way to color halftones, but in private, they expressed a little bit of uncertainty, really favoring their original watercolors and questioning whether the individual prints in isolation really amounted to qualifying as a work of fine art. And in turn, in Of Birds in Texas, Stewart praises the quality of mechanical printing today, but admits a nostalgia for the hand-colored engravings of Audubon's era. And so here, in effect, Scott is turning reproductions back into originals, restoring an artistic hand that the brothers felt was so important to understanding Audubon's supposed ambitions as a fine artist. And in turn, they're kind of stepping back to this origin moment here, where their shared lives began with the joint attempt to copy one of Audubon's compositions. And over time, these acts of imitation gave the brothers a sense of direction and creative drive. And eventually, this close study of Audubon's imagery evolved into a desire to redefine his art historical legacy, to stake a claim to a tradition that started with him and, in their eyes, culminated with them. And so that's where I think these overpaints are so much more than an exercise, but I think should be thought of as this really complex and interesting work of art in themselves, or kind of medium of art that they engaged with throughout their careers. Within them and within Birds of Texas, they present Audubon as a misunderstood romantic, a fine artist concerned above all with the pursuit of beauty rather than the aims of science. And lastly, in these overpaints, Scott comes to finally put himself in place of his predecessor. He substitutes his own brushwork for Audubon's, and he now speaks for history and lays claim to it and takes possession of it as his own. And so, thank you.
Thank you so much, Spencer and Erika. Again, we have time for just a couple questions. Does anybody have, one right in the back.
So, Erika, clarifying before I ask the question this way. So you said when you got involved in the project, that was your first exposure to the Gentlings? Great. Okay, I thought I understood that, so I wanted to say yes. What impact has that had? Obviously, you had a large body of work and study and accomplishment before that. How has your awareness of the Gentlings, how would you build them into that, and how has it changed your perspective on art and history in America and other things you may or may not have been aware of?
Should I just talk in this, Madeline? Yeah. That's a great question, and I think the best thing I can say is there are a lot of artists out there, and yet art history, like so many other fields, is sort of based and built on what archives exist, and sort of a repetition of the stories. And so once again, I was surprised, why don't I know about these artists? I was in the Dallas Museum yesterday, and there were a couple of Texas artists, and I'm like, why don't I know about these artists? We're constantly recovering and reclaiming and rediscovering artists just like this. And it's sort of too bad that they have to slip into something before they appear again. But having archives and this kind of evidence helps us think anew about the field, about these artists themselves. So much of what we do is based on what survives. And I mean, it's a remarkable sort of fortune that there's so much of this stuff that we can now make all these stories out of the Gentling story. So, good question. Thank you.
Do we have another question?
We just stunned them with the glory.
All right. Well, in the interest of time, thank you again, Erika and Spencer, for your excellent presentations today. And yes.
No, I think I did.